So there's this, I don't know, mashup between not giving kids freedom in the real world and pushing everybody back onto their phones. So you really got to remember that independence is just as important as getting away from the phone, because if you don't have independence, the only place that a kid can have fun and be independent and be with their friends and make things happen is the phone. So if you want to get them out of the virtual world, you have to give them back the real world.
Hello, welcome back to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're examining the growing preponderance of anxious and depressed adolescents in the US. We all know that when it comes to young people and mental health, the news is not good. According to Jonathan Haidt, New York University social psychologist and author of The Anxious Generation, the social and cultural factors that have contributed to this surge in mental health issues can be traced back to the mid-2010s, when smartphones and social media began to reshape the social landscape for teenagers. To make matters worse, Haidt claims that smartphone technologies have led to overparenting, constant texting and GPS tracking of their kids' whereabouts, which has robbed an entire generation of resilience and coping skills and the independence required to navigate everyday situations. This has created huge levels of societal anxiety. Well, long sentence there. We're going to unpick some of this today with some experts. What can we do to address and mitigate the problem? And is there any advice that they can offer us? And I have 4 speakers from different disciplines and areas of expertise, but they've all confronted these challenges firsthand, and each comes armed with helpful recommendations. So let me introduce my guest today. Catherine Price is a health and science journalist, founder of Screen Life Balance, and author of How to Break Up with Your Phone. Camilo Ortiz is Associate Professor of Psychology at Long Island University and a licensed psychologist in private practice. Lenore Skenazy is a journalist, president of the nonprofit Let Grow, and author of Free Range Kids. And Shane Voss is coming to us from Colorado. He is head of school at Mountain Middle School in Durango, where he has created a phone-free school environment since 2013. And he's witnessed great academic results as a result of that. So welcome to you all today. Thanks for joining us. Okay, Catherine, let's start with you. You cite some extremely disturbing stats in some of your talks about the all-consuming presence that smartphones now occupy in our everyday life, especially in the American teenage culture. Jonathan Haidt, again from that book about the anxious generation, and you've partnered with, says with the level of attachment that kids place on their phones doesn't simply correlate with youth mental health issues, it drives them. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you've discovered and what actually drove you to write this book, How to Break Up with Your Phone?
First of all, thank you so much for having me and for the conversation we're about to have. So yes, I'm a science and health journalist by background, and I had no previous interest in writing about technology until around 2015 when I had my own daughter. And I started to have these moments when I was up with her late at night, and I would notice that she was looking up at me and I was looking down at my phone. And I like to think I'm relatively self-aware. So when I noticed that this was happening, I was very upset about it for a number of reasons. And I decided I wanted to do something to change my own habits. But I also realized there was not really that much of a conversation around this at that point, and there wasn't what I was really looking for, which was a solution. And so I decided to write a book, which resulted in How to Break Up with Your Phone, which basically looks at why our devices and apps are so hard to look away from, what this is doing to us. And then it also provides a 30-day plan for how to take back control and create a healthier relationship. So that's how I came to this. And over the years, it's just been interesting to see the conversation really ignite around this subject. I know that many of the people on this call have been involved in that since even before I was. I would say that John Haidt has been doing a lot of really great roundup work looking at research studies and analyzing the data and making a very convincing case that this is not a correlational relationship when it comes to the effects of excessive time on things like social media and youth mental health. And I would say just looking at the numbers just as they are, personally, I think that you don't even necessarily need to have this entirely academic debate about it because the numbers are so, I don't know what the right word is, out of control. Impressive would be one word. Just to give some
Gobsmacking.
sense of what I'm talking. Yeah. You know, the average American teenager is spending about 5 hours a day just on social media apps alone, which adds up to about 76 days a year, which if you are awake for 16 hours a day, that's about 30% of your waking life. And the average American teenager is also spending about 7 hours of time per day on non-schoolwork related screen-based leisure activities. That's a lot of time. That's almost half of your waking life. Obviously, some of those overlap. But when I look at that, I just think, how can we possibly be thinking this would not have an effect on how we're living our lives, how our brains are developing, how we're interacting with other people? And thankfully, the research is beginning to bear that out. So I think that hopefully this will become more just understood and accepted as the years progress.
Well, I think we all know now that there's certain damage. I mean, it seems a no-brainer, but you obviously have to have the research to back it up to get things to change. But it's particularly bad for girls for some reason. And that's to do with image, body image, all the sort of problems they have fitting in and group rejection and all that stuff. So first the girl thing, but what about brain development? Do we know anything about brain development that we're losing out because of the lack of face-to-face communication?
I mean, sure. So there's an often cited study that actually was 2018 in the Lancet that talked about how heavy users of social media, they were defining as being more than 5 hours a day for girls in particular, was associated with a 3-fold increase in the rates of depression. So you start to see these signals coming out of the research even as early as 2018. And then in terms of, remind me of the second part of your question. I just
Oh, just about the lack of skills that
yes. Yeah.
like if you don't see people, we had this with Sherry Turkle a couple of years back. She was talking about empathy. If you don't actually read the cues of somebody from physically interacting with them, you don't develop empathy because you
Yes.
don't pick up on that.
So I think the important thing to keep in mind here is the stage of brain development that many of these young people are in. So our brains change all the time through adulthood. Our brains are plastic. We can learn things, we can change things in our brains, but there's a peak period of brain development in early adolescence where the brain is particularly responsive to inputs and it changes even more than at other times in our lives to what we allow into it, right? So babies have an explosion of neurons. They actually have more neurons and connections than adults do. And then in early adolescence, our brains begin to prune these connections because frankly, it's too much. And that means we need to be particularly careful about what we expose our brains to, or rather our children's brains to, when they're in that period of brain development, because that actually can lock in some ways of responding to the world that will be with them for life. So I like to say, in one sense, that's really scary because it leaves kids really vulnerable to being taken advantage of and to have companies shape their brains in ways that help the companies. On the other hand, it's really cool because it means that if kids are educated about this, they actually can make choices that can protect their brains. In terms of some of the effects, I personally find the most powerful sources to look at are the words of tech executives themselves. So the one I wanted to highlight for everyone today is that there actually was a lawsuit that was one of many lawsuits against the social media companies in particular, but it was a multi-state lawsuit. And in October, I believe, there was an unredacted version of this lawsuit that got leaked. It was the Kentucky version of the lawsuit, and NPR got a hold of this. And there were quotes in it that, even having spent this much time, this many years in this space, shocked me to read. And so I wanted to share just one of those. There was a quote from the lawsuit that says that TikTok's own research states that, quote, compulsive usage correlates with a slew of negative mental health effects like loss of analytical skills, memory formation, contextual thinking, conversational depth, empathy, and increased anxiety. So I think if we want to figure out what these platforms and the time we spend on them is doing to us and our children, we should just listen to the companies.
I don't know if you saw this. There's a group of French parents suing TikTok for the fact that unfortunately, their children committed suicide. All of these parents have in common, and they're actually taking a lawsuit against TikTok. So hopefully some dramatic effect will occur. It's a shame it's got to be the death of your child for there to take some measures to kind of regulate this content. It's outrageous, some of the content that these kids are being exposed to. And even though we know in the right part of our brain, saying to kids, this is damaging your brain development. I mean, it's so seductive, it's so addictive. It's very hard for them to wean off of these things because they're deliberately wired for them to want to see more, right? I mean, they're very cleverly constructed. However, let's move along because we've got a lot of people, a lot of stuff to cover. Okay, accompanying the adolescents with their phones and also their parents monitoring them, they now are kind of shielded from having real life experiences and exercising normal, healthy independence because the parents are constantly monitoring them with texts and GPSs, etc. So they're losing out on normal play activities too, because they're never going outside and just running around. So Haidt actually has a quote in his book. He says, a healthy human childhood with a lot of autonomy gets kids' brains to act in a discovery mode with a well-developed attachment system and the ability to handle the risks of daily life. So risks, healthy risks. We don't like the word risk, but it's what life is about. It's part of growing up. And Camilo and Lenore, you wrote a very interesting joint article for the New York Times in September of last year. The title was, if anyone wants to look it up, This Simple Fix Could Help Anxious Kids. So very good article, encouraging independence in your kids, healthy independence. Lenore, maybe we'll begin with you because you took a lot of flack a few years back, quite a few years back. Yeah. Because you wrote about letting your 9-year-old go on the subway in New York.
Right.
And as a result of that, well, you can tell us you started the Let Grow movement.
Yeah, I mean, you've summed it up. I let my 9-year-old ride the subway alone. I wrote a column about it. 2 days later, I was on the Today Show, MSNBC, Fox News, and NPR, defending myself. That weekend, I started a blog. I called it Free Range Kids. I wrote a book called Free Range Kids. And then about 7 years ago, John Haidt came to me and said that kids on campus, we're talking 18, 19, 20-year-olds, were feeling fragile. They were mistaking feeling uncomfortable with actually being unsafe, and therefore, wanting a safe space because they literally felt threatened. And he and a fellow co-founder of Let Grow said, let's start a nonprofit that is not a late stage intervention when kids are that old. Let's try to raise kids who are more open-minded, excited about life, curious, and in explore mode rather than defend mode. And that's when we started Let Grow, and we decided we would make it guaranteeing children independence as they grow up, because that has been disappearing from their kids' lives. And one of the things that we do at Let Grow is we suggest that schools, maybe Shane Voss is already doing this, give kids a homework assignment that says go home and do something new on your own with your parents' permission, but without your parents, because parents have gotten so unfamiliar with when they're even allowed to let their kids walk to the store, go to school on their own, play outside, that they need a little push. Because once you get the push and your kids do walk to the store, walk the dog, climb a tree, make the pancakes, you feel much more calm and happy, and so do they. And it becomes this virtuous cycle. But we have a culture that even before phones was already leeching the independence and free play out of kids' lives for decades. And the one study we like to quote besides Camilo's, and I'm going to throw it to him in a second, is that there was a piece in the Journal of Pediatrics that found that over the decades, not just since COVID, not just since the phone, but over the decades, as kids' independence and free play was going down, replaced with adult organized, structured, supervised activities, their depression, anxiety, and I'd say even passivity have been going up. So if you're going to take away the phone, open the door and give that back to kids, because that's half of the equation. And Camilo has studied the importance of independence when it comes to anxiety. Haven't you?
So Camilo, we're just going to move on to you because you mentioned this independence therapy in that article, and tell us a little bit about what you do and why it works.
Sure. So I loved Lenore's ideas, and I was seeing clinically anxious kids. And so I had the thought that once a week, it was just not going to make a dent in what we were seeing in terms of what Lenore just talked about, the passivity and the avoidance and the anxiety. And so I think I might have coined the term mega doses of independence. And so I said, let's do this every day with kids instead of the traditional like exposure-based approach, which is an effective approach to anxiety. But most kids, the last thing they want to do is after a long day of school, go to a therapist's office and face the thing they're afraid of. And so I start off my first session in a really different way. And it's just a 5-session treatment. It's really simple. I just ask kids, what would you like to do independently that you don't currently do? And they all have answers. And so I pull out a calendar and I say, well, let's check with mom and dad that these are all okay. And let's put at least one of these ideas every day for a couple of weeks. And then we'll check in with you and see how things are going. And we just do that a few times. And we also spend a session with parents to increase their motivation to allow these independence activities, because there are many forces pushing back. Just had a conversation today of a mom who let her son, the horror, run out of her car to a store right next to her car. And a lady stopped him and yelled at him and said, what are you doing out here by yourself? 10-year-old boy. So there's lots of, pressures against these things, but parents, once they get a little bit of permission from a professional, are happy to do this. And it is hard for them the first time, but after, as Lenore said, they get some evidence that they're okay and their kids are okay, then we get this virtuous cycle. And we saw some, really amazing effects with just a 5-session treatment. As I think Lenore wrote in the article, faster than cognitive behavioral therapy and more effective than drugs. But I just want to be clear, this is one study. So
And fun, yeah.
I'm a tentative scientist, and so I want to be careful about that. But the preliminary findings are really exciting.
Honestly, it sounds ludicrous. I mean, I know I'm an older parent, but I just find this whole thing, how did we reach this situation? I remember reading an article, I think I mentioned it to Catherine, in The Lancet, and it was quite a long time ago. And they suddenly had a great crescendo in kids going to the emergency room in England and with broken bones. And they were trying to work out what the problem was. And apparently, these children had never learned to fall. They were falling out of bed because they actually were unaware of, they've been so cosseted. They didn't have the normal spatial awareness you develop from just doing stuff. I mean, everyone I know broke a bone growing up, including me. My kids broke bones. I mean, it just seemed a rite of passage to break a bone. So you're kind of proud of it when you had a cast on, actually. But anyway, so I don't know how we reach such an absurd situation where you get free rein to do crazy stuff on the phone, and yet you can't walk to the store. I mean, was it a gradual development, or is it just this fear-based thing in society that it escalates, that everything is unsafe?
I think the fear-based society has been a gradual development. As you've gotten smaller families and 2 working parents, there's more money that you can spend and more attention that you can spend on each kid. And so the marketplace and the advice and the magazines all rush in to tell you there's something new that you should do. Your kid is in danger if you don't buy this, do this, try this. And pretty soon kids have absolutely no unsupervised, unstructured time, and then they forget how to use their bodies or their brains. That's a short version of my book.
And my field is particularly to blame, the field of clinical psychology, for making parents super worried that if they don't do everything perfectly, their kids won't turn out the way that they want. And we know that that's just not the way children operate. They're highly resilient, and you don't have to be at all perfect. And I just want to point out one thing, which is, I think Mary is a good example with the broken bones. Parents are focused on the risks of independence, but it's harder to see the risks of not allowing independence. And there are so many of those. And this is one of the things that we do in my treatment, is we present both risks, and we acknowledge there are risks when you allow independence, but it is far outweighed by the risks when you control every, activity a child does. And when you see it that way, now we're talking about two different risks, and it allows parents to relax a little bit and see that there is no risk option.
So I hate to throw this in, but I have to. Obviously, guns are a big part of this issue. The amount of guns in circulation, the use of the guns in circulation, which percolates into all sorts of activity. Shopping malls, schools. I mean, places you never, churches. So it's very difficult, isn't it, to navigate this environment, particularly in a school. I'm going to jump across now to you, Shane, because we're very proud to have you on the program, because you were a bit of a trailblazer in instigating a phone-free environment in your charter school in Durango. And I imagine Colorado is a pretty gun-loving area. I imagine quite a few people own guns. I mean, it's just people do, right? They hunt and do all that sort of outdoor stuff. So how have you first navigated this, that you decided this was a good thing for your kids to take phones out of the learning environment? And how did it progress? How did you navigate that discussion with the parents? And what's the outcome been?
Yeah, I came about this with a real common sense approach. My previous 15 years before becoming a school principal, I was a high school teacher. And so I was on the front lines and saw, education change dramatically once, the phones came to be. And I immediately saw there were some warning signs. I definitely saw students were not as present as they used to be. They were distracted. There was a lot of anxiety and depression, signs of depression. Kids are kids, and you're walking around with something that has full access to the internet, and with the phone cameras. I mean, there was already a lot of things happening that were very inappropriate with the phones and the images being shared, and the bullying was 24 hours a day. All of a sudden, it used to be just during the school day, right? But you're now dealing with things that were happening last night and the night before and such. So the warning signs were there. So when I became a principal, it was one of the first things that I approached my staff with. And the school that I had taken over, Mountain Middle School, was last place in Colorado of all public schools in terms of academic performance.
Wow.
And within one school year, we went to the top and earned the state's highest accreditation rating of distinction, and have stayed there. This is my 12th year leading the school, and so we're in the high 90th percentile in every subject matter. I think we teach a lot of etiquette and epistemology. I think that's kind of, if I had to boil it down to two things: how do you know what you know? And there's a proper way to use a phone. And I think these devices came on so quickly that schools weren't ready and parents weren't ready. But we tackled this right out of the gate, and I think it really became part of our culture of teaching kids to be fully present, putting 100% of their energy into a discussion, a Socratic seminar, for example. And the results speak for themselves in terms of the academic performance of the school.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
That's
So-
amazing. From the very bottom to the very top in 1 year.
Yeah, when I told my board I was going to do that, they all fell out of their chairs and started laughing. But we did it, and it was changing the culture, right? So I think there's a lot of things that go into that, but the phone situation, I wasn't looking for any notoriety. I was just doing something that was common sense, but it quickly caught a lot of press. It started with the State Board of Education in Colorado was searching for a school that had done this, and they heard about our school, and we're kind of tucked away in the southwest corner of the state up in the high mountains, and so they came down and visited and started writing articles about what we had done, and then we were featured in an amazing documentary called Trust Me, which is about information literacy and has won all kinds of awards as a top documentary on this issue. And obviously being mentioned as the kind of the model school in Jonathan's book is kind of interesting. I didn't even know that, honestly. I think he picked up an interview I did on Colorado Public Radio and published that in the book. But yeah, it's been really fun.
Okay, so this all sounds great. How did the kids react when you did this first? And what do they actually do? Do they put their phones in pockets as they come in the morning, or how does it work?
Yeah, no, I really think it's simpler than that. And we just had a policy that the phones are off and in the backpack before they enter the front doors of the building, and not out and in use until they exit the building at the end of the day. And it's that simple. I think it's kind of demeaning to ask kids to take their phones out and put them in a pocket on the back of a door and then let them use them during passing time and during lunchtime. Because that's when I think a lot of the inappropriate use is happening. So just to not have them at all being used during the entire school day. Yeah, it was probably a little bit of a learning curve at first, but right now I think our students actually enjoy kind of having this dead period of they can just be a kid for 8 hours and maybe be a kid a little bit longer. And I think that's a quote that's been associated with our school is kids can be kids a little bit longer at Mountain Middle School.
I didn't say that facetiously about docking in their phones, because I went to the theatre a few months ago, and for the very first time, they had all of us dock our phones. I thought it was the most amazing thing, because I am so tired of going to the theatre where the person in front of you is filming the whole thing, person next to you is taking flash photography. I mean, it's just a circus. So I thought this was amazing. And then at break time, these are adults. People couldn't wait to get their phones at intermission. They were allowed access back to the little lockup at intermission. So, you know, as you say, adults set the tone here. It's not just the kids. And if they're on their phone all the time, it's very hard for them to say, don't do as I do, to the kids. So, okay, what about, this came up in the questionnaire that we gave to the people that registered for this program. Unanimously, I'd say probably nearly 90% of people responded to the question of, should parents be helped in phone control by schools limiting or prohibiting the use of the phone? And 90% of people that responded or so said absolutely yes. And then there was a few people that commented, well, what would happen if they need to get hold of their phone if there's an emergency? So tell me about how you deal with that, Shane, at your school.
I'd like to address the first part of your question first. I think is really important. That I think the more you see school districts throughout the country, putting in a cell phone policy, they're giving cover to parents. And I think that cover is really important. So there's a lot of wait till 8th grade or wait till high school now. And so I think that's really good. So giving cover for parents to make this decision, because there's a lot of the peer pressure. Well, my friends have a phone, so I need a phone. But when more schools are doing this, I think it's really, really good for parents to have that cover. The second part, schools were around a long time before cell phones were. And so we have a live voice with our site manager. When you call our school, you're going to get a live voice. I think that's really important to develop that trust with your parent community, that they can get a hold of somebody. And if it is an emergency situation, the school will be sending out, communication, et cetera. And just trust that, the trained professionals are going to handle the situation well. I think there's a really good example of it going poorly for other schools in our community recently, with a lockout situation with our local law enforcement. They were trying to apprehend somebody. And so it's kind of common practice that they notify all the schools to go on lockout until they apprehend somebody. And our students didn't know about any of this, and they just went about their day and weren't filled with anxiety and like what's going on. But some of our staff members had their children attending other schools, and they were, calling and worried and like what's going on. And a lot of conspiracy theories were starting to be spread by the kids. And there's already enough anxiety in their lives, right? And so with school safety and other things. And so let the professionals handle the situation. We're all trained in how to keep kids safe. And I encourage all schools to at least have a live voice where parents can call and get a hold of somebody.
Going back to Jonathan's book, he urges us all to lobby local and federal government to implement changes, one of which he says is changing the age of legal internet adulthood from 13 to 16. So I'm interested in all of you, what you think of that one by one.
Well, broadly, internet adulthood. So I think it's the two E's, right? Etiquette and epistemology. And so I think right now our
Your
challenge
favorite word.
is really teaching kids what is a fact, what is true. And I think a lot of adults in our country need that right now as well. But I think that's kind of what we're doing as schools. But that etiquette, that there's an appropriate way to use things, you know, whether it's a phone or the internet, et cetera, since this is really the predominant way that people are getting their information.
The idea that 13 is currently the age of, quote, internet adulthood is largely the result of a law that was passed in 1998 called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is very outdated. As everyone listening may be aware, the internet is a different place now than it was in 1998, and social media did not exist in 1998, et cetera. But basically, even when that law was written, which was primarily about the age at which companies were allowed to knowingly collect information about children, even when that was written, the proposed age was actually 16 and it was lowered to 13 because of lobbying efforts. So just as background, that has not been updated. So right now, as we speak, there is an active effort to get Congress, or rather the House of Representatives, to vote on the updated version, which is the Kids Online Safety and Protection Act, Safety, Privacy and Protection Act. It's confusing.
Repeat.
COSA. And the issue there, so it was passed, it's an updated version that would actually help regulate more of the design of the apps to keep kids safe from the many, many, many threats that exist on these platforms, not to regulate the content per se, but rather to give them protections and to raise the age of consent for this to 16. It was passed by the Senate in July in an astonishingly bipartisan vote of 91-3, and it's currently in the House. The social media companies do not want this to pass, and they've spent something, I believe, more than $30 million so far to try to get this to not pass, which is important for everybody listening to know, because they have developed very sophisticated arguments targeting both sides of the political aisle to try to get both the left and the right to be against this very common sense law that would help our kids. So if I put a plug in for something, there's actually a really easy tool that this organization called Fair Play created that allows you to call your representative and ask them to pass the Senate version of the bill. And it's really important that this happen before the Congress leaves in mid-December. So I'm going to drop that into the chat, but I've used it myself, and it basically just connects you to some live person, and you just say, I am so-and-so, you know, I really would like the Senate version of this law to be passed so that we can protect our kids. But it's essential. There's no reason, there's no argument that you should have kids as young as 13 be allowed to be on these platforms with all the threats that exist and all the data that's being collected on them.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. What about you, Camilo? What's your view on this?
Well, I have a little bit of an inside view on, given that I'm a clinical psychologist, on how to get people to do things. And it's just a completely unfair fight to have, you know, people like me and thousands of software engineers devising ways to get a 13-year-old to not put their phone down. And so that seems like a really common sense idea to raise the age to 16. About the same time, if all that does is just require you to say, yes, I'm 18, and there's not more teeth to it, I'm not sure that's going to be particularly effective. But I don't know the law, and I imagine there are more pieces to it than that.
If I can jump in with one quick thing, because you make a really good point. Yeah, if you're just ticking a box, like 9-year-olds are on Instagram now. So I should also mention there's also an effort to work on the device side of things, where a device itself could be tagged as a device that belongs to a child as opposed to an adult. And that would essentially signal to companies trying to send stuff through that phone that it's not the device of an adult. So, but I think that's very important, as it's easy to have a law or some kind of rules that don't actually have teeth and that don't make the companies liable and make it very easy to cheat.
Speaking of laws, the law that I wanted to plug, if I might, that's also in the anxious generation, is what we call a reasonable childhood independence law. And it too has a lot of bipartisan support. It has been passed in 8 states, from everything from Utah and Texas to Connecticut and Illinois. So it's very broad-based. And what it says is that neglect is when you put your kid in obvious and serious danger, not anytime you take your eyes off them. And this is just to give parents the reassurance that when you think that your kid is ready to walk to the store or play outside or climb a tree or whatever, it's up to you, and it's not up to the government when that should be. And if you are putting your kid in serious and obvious and likely danger, that's not neglect, that's actually sort of abuse. So we're not saying don't ever investigate parents who are actually hurting their kids, but please don't investigate parents who trust their kids to, say, walk to the store. As you probably heard about this case recently in Georgia, where a 10-year-old walked to the town of 370 people, and his mom was arrested because she didn't know where he was for an hour. And in fact, the punishment for her was to sign, which she has not yet signed, a safety plan put in by Child Protective Services that would require her to download a tracking app on her phone and always track her son. So there's this, I don't know, mashup between not giving kids freedom in the real world and pushing everybody back onto their phones. So you really got to remember that independence is just as important as getting away from the phone, because if you don't have independence, the only place that a kid can have fun and be independent and be with their friends and make things happen is the phone. So if you want to get them out of the virtual world, you have to give them back the real world. And our law helps in 8 states to make that easier. And that's just at Let Grow, if anybody's interested in passing a law in their state.
Good point. Good point. There's a couple of, well, several comments here. Some are questions, some are just comments. So
Always.
one person said, every kid I know understands they will not get a phone until a specific age, but they already know before then that their parents are addicted to the phone. Good point. Is there a way to juxtapose the negative aspects of social media barrage with the good things that happen because of the connections they provide, i.e. a rural American kid connecting and conversing with people in India, Ukraine, Japan, etc., that wasn't possible 20 years ago?
I think there's no question there are positive aspects of phones and social media. I mean, I met Lenore through Twitter, and I consider
Is that how we met?
yes. We were both past the age of when our brains fully developed. So maybe that's what
Maybe you.
made that okay. But yes, both things are true. There are obvious benefits of technology, and there are, especially for young girls, clear dangers. And you know, I like the way that John Haidt talks about this, which is like dropping a grenade into development, which is what a phone is. It would be silly to not have a nuanced view on the pros and cons of technology and phones.
Somebody else has written a comment here, which is a bit of a stretch, I think. Why is it Not Like Us assumed to be bad? I grew up staring at Hanna-Barbera cartoons instead of reading Wordsworth, and I'm fine.
Well, there is some truth to this, and it's kind of interesting that I don't know where I was seeing this, but I was looking back at old newspapers that were talking about actually several stages. When video games were popular, we heard a lot of the same things that we're hearing now. When television replaced radio, and even back to when radio was starting to be a thing, there were newspaper articles about how all kids want to do is sit in front of a radio and they're never going outside again. So I think it's important to understand that context, that adults tend to get worried when there are changes. And at the same time, I think we have good science that this particular change for some kinds of kids, in particular young girls, is clearly bad for them. But you know, that's the useful historical view, that it's important to remember adults in particular tend to get quite upset about changes.
If kids aren't going outside because it's so much more fun to be on their phones and to be texting and to be playing games, what you need is a place where kids can gather, where there's enough other kids so that it's fun, different ages so that it's the way nature always intended kids to play, which was not just 7-year-olds with 7-year-olds. And it has to be a phone-free zone. And that's why we recommend that schools stay open for, we call it a Let Grow Play Club. I don't care what you call it, but just keep some time and some place where kids can gather like a wildlife preserve, where they can live as if it's still 1952 or maybe even 1752, because it's just a bunch of kids, chalk, balls, and maybe, a stick.
Okay, somebody else has written a question here. My twin 14-year-old sons are talented coders, graphic designers, and content creators. They spend time with friends and each other creating video games. As parents, we struggle with limiting their free time because what they're doing is so creative, collaborative, and constructive, but it is still a lot of screen time. What is the balance? Ooh, that's a tricky one.
So cool. If they're creating, that's really different from just consuming, I would say.
It also
What-
appears that they're boys in this question, and so we know that there are absolutely sex differences in the effects of social media. So it may be unfair, but I would be less worried in this case because they are boys.
And I would say it's just a personal consideration. I mean, people always ask me, what's the ideal relationship with your phone? And I say, it's one that makes you feel good about how you're using it. So to me, I would just ask yourselves and also ask your sons, how do they feel about the time they're spending? Do they feel good about it? And then I always personally like to frame it in the context of opportunity cost of, are there other things in real life that they're missing out on because of the things they're doing on the screens? Even if the stuff on screens, from what you said, genuinely sounds like good uses of technology, but just make sure that it feels right when you're comparing it to what they might be doing otherwise with their time in real life. And just to comment on the previous question for a second too about how we're doing just fine, or the question before, I would say, like, if the statistics on kids were that they were doing fine, I don't think we'd have to worry. But if you look at the trends in youth mental health and the advisories that have been issued by people like the U.S. Surgeon General or some of the major health organizations saying we're in a crisis about youth mental health, I think that's why we need to start taking a critical look. Because it's true, there actually was a phase when kaleidoscopes were invented where people freaked out and thought that the world at large was being destroyed by kaleidoscopes. There's these amazing etchings. So we don't want to unnecessarily freak out, but these truly are different devices, different technologies, and they're driven by algorithms that have been specifically designed to capture our attention from us in a way that a traditional television or a landline telephone or the radio
Or kaleidoscope.
certainly a kaleidoscope possibly could have. So we really are looking at a totally different type of technology, and one that's small enough for us to keep in our pocket, that's been deliberately modeled to mimic a slot machine, which is considered to be the most addictive machine ever to have been invented. So I think that that's why this should be a different type of conversation.
Well,
Your
that's a big
listeners
statement.
can look up variable ratio of reinforcement, and you will see how slot machines work and how phones work and why they are so similar.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've never heard that analogy before.
Oh, explain how that works. That's really cool.
That's amazing.
The way that it works is a slot machine and a phone basically are set to, on average, produce a certain amount of reinforcement, but it's not every 8th time that you press the button or that you look at your phone. It's random. It's on average every 8th time. And so what that means is that you're never quite sure if you're going to get the like or the comment. And so you have to keep checking. And whether you're a pigeon pecking at a disc or, a grown adult, it works exactly the same way. And it's why we feel that desire to want to turn over our phones constantly, even when there's not apparently a great reason to do it. It's just one of the most fundamental principles of animal learning, and they know very well how to use it.
Yeah, it's called brain hacking as the technical term, or the term used by a lot of tech engineers of how are you going to hack people's brains so that they will have what Camilo is referring to, the dopamine response that's going to motivate them to continue to the behavior. And like he's saying, variable rewards are one of the biggest triggers, and so is anticipation. So if you think about how when you pull a slot machine lever, you have to wait to see if those cherries are going to line up. Even in the modern slot machines where it's just pushing a button, you don't have to have that waiting period. That's there so that you release anticipatory dopamine, which will motivate you to do it again and again and again and not get up. And you have the same thing on your phone where you're waiting for a second to see if you got a new message, or you have the anticipation there might be something there. And so even when your phone's nearby, it's very hard not to have part of your attention trained on it. But the more you start to learn about the techniques used in slot machines and compare them to some of the techniques that are embedded in our most time-sucking apps, you realize these are essentially the same devices. It's just one is kept in our pockets at all times that we're giving to our children.
That's right. That's the grenade analogy. We're basically dropping that on our kids' laps.
That was amazing. You reminded me when Sherry Turkle was talking about these gadgets, she said that they did research, and just by the very fact that you have a phone on the table during a conversation, you don't even have to be looking at it. It changes the quality and the length of time that the person actually has the discourse. So this thing has enormous impact, whether we admit it or not. And I think this is amazing, Catherine. I mean, I hope you're going around schools giving these talks, because I don't think people have any idea of the length of sophistication that these designers have gone to create these things. It's not accidental that these things work the way they do, and then market to you at the same time.
There's a couple of videos I have on the resource page that I know we dropped in the chat a little while ago. I'll do so again, but there's a clip of two of the founding executives from Facebook talking about their own products and some of the stuff that I was just talking about, and how they have changed their own use of the products and limited their own children's access to social media apps. That personally I find even, it's more compelling than hearing someone like me talk about it. It's from the people who actually design these apps. So
there's a good point here, which I have failed to raise, which is the new introduction, well, not new, but the growth of flip phones as a good substitute for smartphones. Someone said, the reason I'm smart enough for myself is I keep my flip phone and it's just fine. So does anyone know about these kids? Do any of you know kids that have these flip phones?
No, I actually don't know. I know about them. I don't know of a single parent who has you, and I will not
do.
hang our hopes on this.
I do.
Okay.
Paul, okay. Paul, we had this guy on last year. Paul Greenberg, Goodbye Phone, Hello World. I spoke to him a year ago when he brought this out, because he calculated he had lost 1 year of time with his teenage son through being on the phone, and that was too much. So he decided to do away as a journalist with his smartphone and just uses a flip phone. And I checked in with him last week, and he's still using the flip phone very successfully. He hasn't ruined his career. In fact, it's enhanced it, he thinks. But one point he did raise, he tried, of course, to do this a little bit as an example to his son. They still have phone-free dinners. They still on phone-free vacations. But he said it's awfully hard, and this speaks to you, Shane, to do anything like this with change unless you've got a peer group of support, hence the need for the phone-free school. It's very hard to go it alone as a parent if you haven't got the community supporting the action. Okay, we've got a couple more questions.
If I can throw something in as a suggestion for parents, just in terms of the flip phone thing, I think one thing that parents and just all of us kind of miss when we have this conversation is that we tend to lump smartphones in with other types of phones, and we tend to lump smartphones and social media together, but they're all separate things. So I think that thankfully consensus seems to be emerging around the idea that for many kids, social media, for many people, social media is not a good thing, especially in excess. But then we have the question of smartphones versus flip phones, and none of the mental health effects that we're concerned about as a society seem to be associated with the use of making phone calls on a flip phone, or probably what many of us on this call and discussion grew up with, grabbing the phone and having a conversation with your friend. It's much more about the apps and the asynchronous communication that's happening on them. So what I always recommend to parents is try to delay as long as possible, and going to what Lenore and Camilo are talking about, give your kids independence, try to resist the urge to track. But if and when it becomes time for them to have some kind of communication with you, start with a family loaner phone, where you can just have a phone that doesn't belong to anybody. Ideally not a smartphone, because you don't want, remember, if you give your kid a smartphone, it's access to the entire internet, and it's also giving everyone on the internet access to your child. So don't start with that. start with a family flip phone. They're cheaper than iPhones. You can do a pay by the minute plan and just lend it out as you think is necessary and take it back. And then if you are going to get your kid their own phone, you could start with the flip phone, or there's also a whole variety of what are known as smartphone alternatives on the market now from a variety of companies, and they all have different functionalities, but you can think of them as like smartphones and watches as like training wheels for the internet. They don't have access to social media on them, and they have very limited internet access. So you can do your research. I actually wrote a roundup for my Substack that people are welcome to check out, but you can pick what might be right for your family and for your kid. But that's a much smarter, I think, alternative to give your kid than giving them a full-fledged smartphone from the get-go. Because, it's the same as with cars. Eventually, most of our kids are going to learn to drive, unless you're like me and you grew up in New York and you still hate it, even though you're 46 years old. But you wouldn't hand someone like a 9-year-old the keys to your car with no preparation. So I would suggest taking a similar approach. But I think a lot of adults and parents are not aware of these alternatives that are out there, but they are out there. And the more kids are on them, the less excluded they're going to feel if they're the kid without the smartphone, quote unquote.
Okay, this is an interesting point someone's made here, and maybe Shane, you have an opinion on this. Somebody says, I work in the overnight camp industry. Camps are phone and device free for kids. The simplicity, authentic relationship building, and learning about skills such as conflict resolution in person is unparalleled. But now parents want camp directors to send photos and emails about their children every day, which takes them away from running the camps and centering the kids themselves. What are your panel's thoughts on how this can be reconciled? That's a great problem to try and have to deal with.
Yeah, I
So
would simply say no. I feel like asking schools to do the same, right? Let's put live cams in every classroom so the parents can, watch the lessons being taught. I think you got to draw a line there. But what I hear back from a lot of school leaders that have implemented the phone-free policy is it's become a heads-up culture. And it's really, there's a beautiful sound of free play, and there's a beautiful sound of conversations now happening amongst kids. And going from a head down culture to a head up culture is really remarkable to see. And kids are resilient and they want to connect, and they will connect. And that's that balance that parent was looking for in that previous question, is that social connection is really positive. So moving to a heads up culture.
We've only got 5 minutes left. Somebody else has said, my niece started a group with other parents to make common rules on phone use. All the parents have followed through. So there's no, but so-and-so gets to use her phone. Yeah, that can work if everybody's on board with it.
That's really smart, because it really only takes one parent to bust the well-meaning effects of a bunch of other parents. And, I see this all the time, but parents lately have a hard time being firm with their kids about things, especially if there's a comparison made to another child. So I love that idea.
Here's a great observation. My daughter actually had to destroy, i.e. throw her smartphone in the river so she could break her social media habit. She got a flip phone from a carrier as a replacement. Wow.
Probably
That's
not great for the river, but
well, no, probably not. But it speaks
All
to
those
the level
fish
of the
addicted
problem.
to social media.
It speaks to the level of the problem. Yeah. Wow. Okay. In the last few minutes, is there anything anybody feels a burning desire to mention that we didn't cover, or a pearl of wisdom to impart?
I wouldn't mind just quickly discussing what I call the 4 Ds, which is those stand for discomfort, distress, disappointment, and danger. And I would just like to encourage parents to rethink parenting in a way that the more experience their kids have with the 4 Ds, the better a job they're doing, and not the other way around. So discomfort, distress, disappointment, and danger. Kids need a lot of all of those things.
Danger.
It makes me feel a lot better about my parenting.
Right.
I sometimes put mild in front of danger in parentheses.
Right. They're saying a lot more of everything except danger itself. I mean, the point is that they need a lot more reality in their lives. And one of the reasons that they're so addicted to technology is that that's where all the excitement is. That's where they're allowed to go without constant adult supervision. Why don't we flip it? right? But no, the flip phone, flip it. Let your kids, we did a study of kids who had been in a play club, and we asked, do you like play club more, where your kids just playing around, or do you like video games? And the most poignant response was from a kid, like 4th grade, who said he loves video games, but he said, when I take off the headset, there's no one there. And for that reason, he prefers real life, because when you play with your friends, you get to see them over and over again. And it's real life has a lot of attraction for kids. We've taken it out of their purview. Let's put it back.
Okay, and just going back to a point that Shane had talked about in terms of the ethics and the principles that they're building in their students, which I think are amazing, sort of philosophical principles. I think it's very important for kids to be able to differentiate between fact and fantasy, and also truth and a lie. And I think the constant bombardment of this blurs all that. It blurs it all. And that's how they can't actually learn critical thinking skills. And I think media literacy needs to be injected back into school curriculum, as it is in a lot of European schools now, learning media literacy. Because Paul was saying to me, the journalist, the giving up your iPhone, that he lectures students, graduate students, and he used to ask them what they read, 5 years ago. Where do you get your information? What do you read? And they would quote where they got their information. Now he says, where do you get your information? And they say, the phone. And he says, where? And they said, whatever comes up, whatever comes up. So that's not teaching any kind of search skills or critical thinking. And that's what's missing, I think. You just become a consumer for everything. So I'll get off my soapbox now. So I think this has been remarkably interesting and helpful, this discussion. And I personally have learned a lot. And I hope parents and other interested parties that weighed in and listened learned something and are a little bit reassured that all is not lost as regards the phone universe. So I'd like to thank my 4 wonderful speakers today, Shane Voss, Lenore Shanese,
Whatever.
get it right, Catherine Price, and Camilo Ortiz. It's been great, and I hope you get all the links that we put in the chat there for further exploration, resources, information that you can pass along. So I'd like to thank everyone that joined us today. I'd also like to thank Dorothy and Herbert Vetter, the Lowell Institute, Mass Cultural Council, and you. Thanks for joining us.